Welcome everyone to the first Archeo Gaming Con. I am the principal investigator of the Purgatory Archaeological Survey. I just want to state outright that most of these images I will be showing today are the property of the creators of Wynonna Earp, which you can watch on Netflix, and the new season is currently airing on Sci-Fi. In the meantime, I want to make it clear that this whole presentation has been previously re-recorded, but through the magic of the internet, I can be two places at once. I can be here in the past talking to you and here in the present in the chat bar. So I really encourage you to add some comments or questions as we go along, and I will do my best to answer them in real time. I will also have my contact information at the end of this presentation if you want to shoot me a message if you have any questions you think of later. Also, while I am the last presentation for today for the con, Archeo Gaming Con picks up again tomorrow, and there's a lot of amazing content for you guys to watch covering all kinds of games and all kinds of archaeology topics, so you should definitely check that out. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking today while residing on the ancestral homelands of the Omaha, Ponca, and the Oto tribes. All right, let's get started. First, we need some context for location. Waverly Earp, a vocational archaeologist, was kind enough to lend us this vintage map of the Ghost River Triangle on the right, which she had collected during her time researching the history of Purgatory, and one can clearly see Purgatory called out just to the northwest of the big city on the cusp of Banff National Park. One can also see the international borders of the Ghost River Triangle. The Ghost River flows through Purgatory generally west to east, originating in the Rockies and ending in Ghost Lake. Many people aren't aware of the context of how the Ghost River got its name, and to be fair, there are many gaps in the legends, but what we do know is that the mountain range to the west of Purgatory boasts some of the peaks which give credence to the spooky stories that we have in here in our small town. Surrounding the spring of the Ghost River is a number of mountains with colorful names: Zombie Peak, Psychic Peak, Haunted Peak, Apparition Mountain, Spectral Peak, Devil's Head, and my favorite, Revenant Mountain. Reportedly, the Palliser expedition, which came through the area in 1858 through 1859, gave the Ghost River its foreboding name based on local indigenous stories of ghostly occurrences in the area. In the subsequent years, the mountain's monikers matched the tone of the old river as well. According to the archaeological record, indigenous peoples have lived in this area for more than 10,000 years, which we will touch on later in this presentation. To date, there are 416 indigenous archaeological sites and 309 historic sites which have been recorded in Banff National Park, not including the sites in the expansive area of the Ghost River Triangle. While Purgatory boasts its own fascinating history, especially in the role it played in the Old West, the region around our town is rich in indigenous history and natural beauty. As this presentation progresses, we will be delving into a little more information on what to do if you find an archaeological site, and if you do, how to be a good steward of the past. This photo on the left of an original map of the Ghost River Triangle was recently shared on social media from apparently the Earp Homestead, and the Purgatory Archaeological Survey has some observations. The map on the right shows two different triangulations of the Ghost River Triangle. The previous map I showed you has the Ghost River Triangle highlighted in red. The green triangle represents the triangulation based on the map on the left. And as you can see, there are some differences between the two maps. The two most notable differences are the location of Purgatory and the boundaries of the Ghost River Triangle itself. Now, the Ghost River Triangle triangulation has been up for some debate for some time, as it is folklore and stories do seem to shift as they're told through generations. So the shape of the triangle and the location points are understandably not a consensus. However, the location of Purgatory itself is what's most perplexing to me. The date of the older map at the Earp Homestead is unknown, but it does appear to be similar to those printed in the 1960s, while the map that was provided by Miss Earp in our previous analysis may date to the 1980s or 1990s, which obviously could mean that the earlier map was using less precise measuring metrics. Someone made a costly annotation error to the print itself, and also, why is the town of Monument the only other labeled location on the older map besides the big city? All of these burning questions that may only be solved by closer inspection of the Earp Homestead Ghost River Triangle map, I hope. Because surely it goes against reason that the town of Purgatory could actually have moved, right? Okay, so we have our locational bearings of where the Ghost River Triangle and Purgatory is located. So let's get more context of what archaeology is. So archaeology is the material remains of past human life and activities. So things like tools, pottery, structures, or remains of structures. The evidence left behind by organic material like food or wood decaying leaves marks in the soils for archaeologists to find. It is the material remains of a culture, of a people. It is not dinosaurs, which is paleontology. So think more Indiana Jones, less Jurassic Park. So when I say a site, what does a site mean? A site is a defined location of where human activity took place in the past based on the material remains I just mentioned, or historical records, or oral traditions. You can have a collection of sites. Usually it gets lumped into a district. So sometimes you hear the term historic district, usually in a neighborhood or an old town, which just makes it for an easier designation when you have a large cluster of very similar sites. Generally in the US and Alberta, a historic site, and when I use that term, I mean post-contact or post-European contact, as opposed to prehistoric, which is definitely falling out, which just means pre-European contact. A site is generally definable as 50 years or older. 50 years or older. So obviously that's a moving target. But this can also differ by state and location depending on the type of site you have. So for example, in Colorado, if you come across an extinct railroad section, they will want to record that as a site. But if you came across a similar railroad in Oklahoma or Kansas, they're not going to want to record that as a site. They're going to want you to go ahead and just record that in your notes or in your report, give it an isolated find number, and move on. So obviously there's a lot of variables with this, but if you find a site that you think is 50 years or older, it's best just to default to the experts. In this presentation, we're going to go over a handful of site types that are common in the Ghost River Triangle, some broad strokes of Purgatory's history, and then later we'll wrap up with how you can be a good steward of archaeology, what that looks like, and how you can get more involved. The sites and history we will discuss are by no means meant to be exhaustive. It's impossible to fit 10,000 years of human history in a 1-hour presentation. As we go through this presentation, I'll have lumped together some sites with similar characteristics that made them easier to discuss in a group. One such grouping is wells and mines. While wells are usually associated with domestic structures where people lived, and mines are usually industrial structures where people work, they're both common in the region of Purgatory, and they both should be treated warily and with much precaution. Historic water wells are common across the landscape in Purgatory as well as the surrounding countryside. The wells pictured here are examples of circular stone-walled water wells with shaped stones and mortar to increase the integrity of the feature. Many wells no longer retain the wooden well cover as shown in the top middle photo, a feature which allows for easier dating of such wells. Most rock-lined circular water wells are initially hand-dug and around Purgatory date to the early non-Indigenous immigrant settlements in the area, usually between 1820 to 1900. Without other associated homestead features such as ceramic crockery, glass, shards retaining markers or maker mark emblems, or definitive land ownership records, dating such water wells is difficult. While these wells dot the landscape and can seem to be the only structure in an otherwise open field or deserted forest, these wells are archaeological sites within themselves and are usually associated with other features once an archaeological investigation has taken place. If you note one of these wells while on a hike or behind your family farm, be careful not to damage the feature and notify our office and allow us to document the site. And as always, be careful around such sites as mortar may be faulty, rocks may have shifted, and debris may have filled in the well, making it appear more shallow than the shaft actually extends, as documented by recent accidents of individuals falling in and being trapped in wells like local criminal Bobo Del Rey. We have a lot of feelings about Bobo here at the survey. Thanks to John Henry Holliday for notifying us about the well on the Earp Homestead, and for the Earp sisters for allowing us onto their property to record the site. Whoops. Let's talk about mines. So in and around our town, precious metals, base metals, and energy minerals have all been leading mining resources in our regional history. Indigenous peoples mined copper, gold, silver, and chert for thousands of years before European explorers became aware of the land's natural resources. While early non-native settlers exploited small quantities of mining resources in the 16th and 17th century, and the 18th and 19th century saw the first mining boom in the region, first in the form of iron and coal, and later large-scale exploitation of gold and silver, which would spur mass movements of people across the landscape, simultaneously sprouting boom towns. Purgatory was one such of these mining boom towns in the discovery of coal and then copper in the early 19th century. By 1875, the silver vein had been exhausted in Purgatory. By 1910, the coal had also been depleted, and many of the mines partially filled and abandoned. In the 1930s, uranium ore was first discovered around Purgatory, and the refinery was constructed a few hundred miles outside of the Ghost River Triangle. In 1944, the federal government took over the mining of uranium in Purgatory and across the country for the war effort. Post-war, the government lifted prospecting, allowing for private industry once more, but by that time, many of Purgatory's uranium deposits were depleted, and many of the uranium mines joined the ranks of the silver and coal mines in the region and were abandoned. Many of these abandoned mines can still be found in and around Purgatory, with much of the area unrecorded due to the unsafe conditions. While these mines played a major role in the founding, populating, and progress of our town, they are now structurally unsound and not safe for exploration. If you observed a capped or uncapped mine shaft while hiking or exploring the region around the town, please inform the survey and do not attempt to enter the mine. Next, let's go over a brief highlight of the Earp Homestead. When folks hear the name Wyatt Earp, they don't immediately think of Purgatory. They think of Tombstone, Arizona, Dodge City, Kansas, and so on. But our records show that Wyatt did spend some time here in Purgatory, and his family remained here as he continued his travels. The Earp Homestead, located on the outskirts of Purgatory, boasts a colorful past above ground and below. For unknown structural benefits, the original homestead was constructed on a bedrock of naturally occurring amylite, an opal-like gemstone laid down during the Cretaceous period when a subtropical sea abutted the Rocky Mountains. The original homestead was constructed by the famous gunslinger Wyatt Earp sometime after 1881. The original structure was razed, and the current structure was rebuilt on the same footprint sometime after 1900, along with associated shed and barn. Additional rooms added over the course of 50 years. The house itself remained a vernacular pioneer style with a cross-gabled roof, wood siding, and natural stone chimney. Along with the domestic structure, the property also included an open gabled wooden barn with an additional shed lean-to, a corral with associated animal loafing shed, and nearby windmill water pumps still functional. The homestead sat abandoned after the tragic murder of Ward, the great-grandson of Wyatt Earp, in 2000, which resulted in the property being abandoned and falling into disrepair. While modifications have impacted the historical integrity of the structure, the association of the house with the historic figure Wyatt Earp and the ownership of the property remaining within the Earp family, with evidence of land patent and chain of ownership records, indicates that this property may be potentially eligible under Criteria B of the National Register of Historic Places listing. The NRHP nomination of the Wyatt Earp Homestead is currently under review to ensure that the property has federal protections for preservation. Our team lacks an architectural historian, so if you can lend a hand to the structure descriptions for the nomination, let us know. Also, thank you to Winona Earp, and especially the tireless researcher, her sister Waverly, for providing the photos and information about their family home. This section will be a collection of some different types of structures and historic associations of buildings in Purgatory. Shorty's Saloon is more than just Purgatory's favorite bar, voted in 2017. It's also been a staple in the Purgatory community for the last 140 years. Originally known as the only saloon in town, the original structure at the current location was destroyed in a fire in 1898. Two more structures with varying structural integrity would follow, with the building we know today being constructed in 1914. In 1979, Robert Shorty Simon purchased the bar and transformed the property into our much-beloved Shorty Saloon. In 1985, Curtis and Augusta McCready purchased the bar from Mr. Simon, but Shorty stayed on working at the bar, and the name remained the same. The well-known gunslinger Wyatt Earp was known to frequent the saloon in Purgatory's Wild West days, a fact which management has always highlighted. Unfortunately, we lost Shorty Simon 2 years ago to a sudden heart attack, but he will be fondly remembered by everyone here in Purgatory. While the bar fell into some state of disuse after poor management under Bobo Del Rey, current management under John Henry Holliday has revived the saloon back to the state Mr. Simon would have been happy to see. The saloon has been nominated for NRHP listing under Criteria C, as it is an example of a two-story gabled roof Western false front architecture, and under Criteria B with its association with Wyatt Earp. However, in the town of Purgatory, there are better examples under each criteria, and therefore the building has not been listed but remains no less special to our residents. Purgatory, while small, has always been proud of our historical buildings. Buildings such as Shorty's, which we just discussed, may seem like an obvious choice in historic consideration. The Wyatt Earp Homestead is another structure which seems obvious to hold up as historically significant. However, regular domestic structures that can be found in almost every old neighborhood of our small town and others like it boast fine examples of historic architecture styles that deserve our attention. One such house is owned by Sheriff Nicole Hott. Our beloved sheriff purchased the home 4 years ago upon moving to Purgatory, but the house has an architectural contextual history all its own. Sheriff Hott's house is a fine example of a gabled vernacular style popular from the mid-1880s to the end of World War I. Popular with this style is the front gabled roof with a full-width porch, with the front porch door offset to one side of the facade. The exterior of these homes commonly have few decorative features, unlike their craftsman-style cousins. The interior is also craftsman-style adjacent, with improvements to the home over the years looking more and more similar to one another. The interiors usually display exposed wood beams with wood-paneled ceilings, plenty of built-in storage space within the home, and bay windows in the lower floors. Sheriff Hott's home has seen renovations in the 1920s and 1960s while still maintaining its original bones. While most of the renovations and the ubiquitousness of the home style in the area makes this house ineligible under National Register of Historic Places criteria, it nonetheless represents a peak of domestic construction in Purgatory when we had a booming mining industry. And thank you to Sheriff Hott for giving us a tour of her house. With tweets seemingly every day from a certain president referencing witch hunts, one would think this activity is a common pastime in North America, when in fact a witch trial hasn't occurred on this continent officially since 1878. 1878, that's super late, and yes, it was in Salem, Massachusetts. The second Salem witch trial, as it was called, was later dismissed by the judge. However, there are many other witch trials that are not, as well documented, shall we say. One such trial took place here in Purgatory in 1887. The victim was a young woman by the name of Maeve Purley. It was rumored in the town that Maeve practiced black magic regularly in her medicinal aid of women in the town. Much like the individuals accused of witchcraft in the centuries before, Maeve's voluntary unmarried status, surly behavior toward men, and other unorthodox behavior drew attention and suspicion from townsfolk. Documentation is lacking for the chain of events that led to Maeve's death, but what is known is that eventually a mob gathered at her door, surrounded her house, a kangaroo court preceded her death, which was burning at the stake. As Purgatory was a frontier town at the time and lawlessness ran rampant, unofficial justice was not uncommon. However, the fervor and fear that riled even the most law-abiding citizens to participate in Maeve's death is singular in Purgatory's history, but unfortunately a textbook occurrence when compared to similar events in North America and across Europe in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. Maeve's original homestead is still standing today. The house is now owned by one of Maeve's descendants, Greta Purley. Greta was kind enough to allow Sheriff Nicole Hott and John Henry Holliday to give PAS a tour of the homestead. While the gruesome murder of Maeve Purley is a blemish on our town's history, PAS shares this event with the hope of illuminating the potential horror and heinousness of persecuting those who did not or do not, quote, fit the mold of cultural and societal norms, and sometimes deadly role that fear can play in a collective conscience. So the next time you see the accusation of a witch hunt, be reminded of real people who lost their lives to narrow allowances for differences and false fears built on misunderstandings and prejudging, instead of public figures of ill repute who feigned persecution at the hint of criticism. Also, check out the University of Edinburgh's super interesting, free, online interactive map of individuals in Scotland who were accused of witchcraft. It's a great collection of historical records that they put together for people. It's open access. Up next, I have some larger regional or nationally associated history that I'd like to touch on. Prohibition in the United States was nationwide. A constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages that took effect from 1920 to 1933 under the Volstead Act of 1919. While many in the temperance movement believed that prohibition would limit crime and overall societal corruption, it in fact opened the door for further organized crime throughout the country. Our town of Purgatory also saw its fair share of criminal activity around the production and sale of liquor, or bootlegging. A handful of other reputable establishments became covers for speakeasies, with other establishments acting as transportation stops along liquor's final destinations. In 1935, just after the end of Prohibition, some of Purgatory's infrastructure was updated. It was during one of these construction projects that smuggling tunnels were located under Main Street toward the north side of town. These tunnels were subsequently capped and covered, but remain a reminder of our town's ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit during the time of limited opportunity, which coincided with the Great Depression. However, because of the illegal nature of these activities, much of the history surrounding bootlegging and speakeasy establishments still remain unknown. So if you know of a structure that played a role during this period of history, or a story of one of Purgatory's more entrepreneurial citizens during Prohibition, let our office know. The name Boot Hill was given to many cemeteries across the American West in the mid to late 19th and 20th century. The term comes from the fact that many of the dead, namely gunslingers, died with their boots on. The most notable Boot Hill cemetery is in Tombstone, Arizona, while it's widely recognized that the first cemetery with that name was in Hays, Kansas. Other notable Boot Hill cemeteries are located in Dodge City, Kansas, and Deadwood, South Dakota. In Tombstone, the most notable individuals buried on Boot Hill are Billy Clanton, Frank McLaury, and Tom McLaury, who were killed during the gunfight at the OK Corral. Our own John Henry Holliday, named after the famed gunslinger Doc Holliday, offered PAS some insight on his research in this event. While the famous gunfight still holds a prominent place in Old West history and frequently drifting into Old West lore, the event itself only lasted approximately 30 seconds. The gunfight was a culmination of a feud between Billy Claiborne, Ike and Billy Clanton, and the McLaurys, and the Tombstone Marshal Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, Wyatt Earp, and Doc Holliday. Doc Holliday, along with Virgil and Morgan, were wounded in the fight, while Clanton and the McLaury brothers were killed. It was estimated that 300 people joined the funeral procession for the three dead gunslingers up to Boot Hill, and as many as 2,000 people watched from the surrounding area of the graveyard. Due to the sometimes unclear or incomplete record system of these frontier towns, it's common for unmarked graves to be present in and around Boot Hill cemeteries, scattered throughout the West, as well as older or more remote graveyards in frontier towns long gone. Subsequently, there have been efforts over the years by archaeologists to locate some of these potential grave locations using tools such as ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, that allow archaeologists to look underground for disturbed areas without disturbing possible burials with earth-moving equipment. There's currently a very important and fascinating GPR work and study being done in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with attempts to relocate mass graves associated with the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 that you should look into if you'd like to learn more about how GPR works in this context. The Boot Hill Graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in October of 1966 as part of the Tombstone Historic District. With the recent passing of Deputy Marshal Dawes, a lawman who died with his boots on, John Henry Holliday and the staff at PAS would fondly remember his contribution to the Purgatory community. This next section is a very brief overview of some sites that are commonly associated with pre-contact indigenous sites. Pre-contact sites commonly found in the Ghost River Triangle today vary a great deal. Imagine the breadth of occupation and activities including villages, campsites, meeting places, ceremonial locations, hunting and bison kill sites. Imagine the types of tools and material footprint all of these activities would leave behind after thousands of years. Lithic tools, or stone tool sites, are usually the most common considering how often people would need to have resharpened or made cutting or scraping implements while at their village or camp or hunting trip. Domestic structures would have been made from wood and hides, two materials which usually don't stand to the test of time very well on the plains, and so archaeologists depend on changes in soil texture and color to see where organic material might have decayed. Using stones to surround the base of a teepee were common, so slight depressions and teepee rings can sometimes still be seen on the landscape. Stacks of stones, known as cairns, that create a kind of track to push bisons into corrals or off of cliffs are also common. The bison kill sites themselves are also archaeological sites where we can see evidence of butchering and stone tools that were left behind or broken. Ceremonial sites that were also sometimes constructed from placing stones on the ground surface have remained in place for hundreds of years and have been recorded all across the northern Great Plains. Some of these sites, known as petroforms, have been documented in the shapes of medicine wheels or animals like turtles, as well as more anthropomorphic images, or people. Much of Purgatory and the surrounding region are the ancestral lands of the Nakota, also known as the Assiniboine or Stony Nakota First Nation, Tsuut'ina or Sarsi First Nation, Ga'aina or Blood First Nation, Bakani or Piegan First Nation, Tunaha or the Kootenai Nation, Siksika or Siksika First Nation, also known as the Blackfeet, the Plains Cree, and the Anishinaabe or Plains Ojibwe. The traditional Plains tribes' lifeways meant that these tribes were experienced bison hunters and fishermen who lived in seasonal camps or villages while following large bison herds, but also hunting other big and small game while practicing horticulture according to the seasons across the landscape. The Nakota people developed a powerful influence in the region with neighboring Plains Cree, or Nahio, tribes that moved into the area around 1740, and the Anishinaabe, or Plains Ojibwe, as well as the Métis and Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, who had come west with the fur trade. This alliance became known as the Iron Confederacy, which vied for dominance with the Blackfoot Confederacy for the territory ranging north from the North Saskatchewan River to the Missouri River in the south, from the Rocky Mountains to the present Saskatchewan border with Alberta. The Blackfoot Confederacy was also a historic collective name for linguistically related groups, the Siksika, the Ga'aina, and the Piikani. The Tsuut'ina and the Aninin, or the Gros Ventre, spoke different languages, but also allied with the Blackfoot Confederacy. Each of these people groups also had many bands within each tribe. Both of these alliances were a means of friendly trading and control of bison hunting territories, which were already incredibly important to their subsistence practices and culture, but had also become more crucial due to European interest in access for hides and furs. These confederacies also offered some form of shared kinship, religious ceremony, and culture, and also a means of defense, protection, and political power. Guns and horses were a major currency and status symbol in the historic plains among the tribes. Raiding and counter-raiding became commonplace and fueled a warrior culture among neighboring tribes. The Nakota became a major trade partner with the European traders in the region, but the Blackfoot Confederacy also acquired horses via trading and raiding. However, between 1790 and 1850, the Iron Confederacy reached its height, successfully pushing out much of the Blackfoot Confederacy from their territory. A major contributing factor to the dominance of the Iron Confederacy during this time period was the devastating outbreak of cholera and smallpox among the Blackfoot in 1837 as a direct result of European contact through trading. By the mid-1800s, however, contact with the Europeans resulted in devastating numbers of deaths caused by infectious diseases for all the First Nations peoples. The Nakota, for example, were estimated at 10,000 people in the early 18th century to approximately 2,600 people by 1890. The decline of the fur trade and overhunting of bison herds nearly eradicated the Plains tribe's primary food source, and along with a decimated population due to disease, led to both confederacies breaking down. With the near extinction of the bison in the 1880s, their primary food source, the Nakota, the Blackfeet, and their allied tribes reluctantly agreed to live on reserve lands. In Canada, separate bands of the tribe signed a number of treaties which were devastating to the indigenous peoples. In the U.S., government food supplies were often spoiled or failed to arrive at all. Desperate, many bands turned to raiding immigrant white settlements for food and supplies. The latter half of the 18th century saw skirmishes, battles, and bloody massacres between indigenous Plains peoples and the federal military. Reservation borders in the U.S. were changed without warning and without compensation. As a result, many Blackfoot bands moved further north back up into Canada. The government in both Canada and the U.S. restricted tribes and First Nations religious ceremonies, infringed on political activity, and in the following decades, frequent abuse and cultural disassociation in residential schools, limited education and training, and systematic discrimination, along with poor housing and healthcare, was endemic. In 1934, in the U.S., the Indian Reorganization Act allowed the tribes to choose their own government and observe cultural practices. The Indian Act, passed in 1951 in Canada, removed restrictions on religious ceremonies and political activity, which resulted in increased civil rights and sovereignty activism, including reinstating of banned lands and reserve status that had been stolen by the government in 1901. Today, the First Nations within Alberta exercise various degrees of self-government through elected band councils, but under restrictions of the Indian Act, the Canadian Constitution of 1982, court decisions, and the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. Through community-led initiatives, healthcare, education, and language resources have been numerous and successful. However, a number of systemic challenges are still faced by First Nations and tribal nations in Canada and the U.S. Sovereignty is continually undermined, and colonizer governments repeatedly suppress Indigenous voices, rights, and self-determination. So while we enjoy the beautiful landscape of Purgatory and the Ghost River Triangle, bear in mind that they are the rightful and ancestral lands of the Nakota, Sarcee First Nation, Blood First Nation, Piegan First Nation, Kootenai Nation, the Blackfeet, Plains Cree, and the Plains Ojibwe. This was an incredibly brief and condensed history of numerous indigenous tribes that primarily focused on 200 years of recent history. Indigenous people have occupied this land for over 10,000 years, to put that into perspective. I encourage you to learn more about the indigenous people groups whose land you more than likely reside on today. I also encourage you to find ways to be a helpful ally in their continued fight for sovereignty in all forms. Future sites deserve their own mention. Archaeology is being continually created as time goes on. Events that are happening now will be history later. So what's an example of an archaeological site in the future besides the obvious house or school, etc.? Recent research has shown that forest fires in the Great Plains have tripled between 1985 and 2014. Here in the grasslands, we regularly have our seasonal forest fires and grass fires, which are imperative to maintain a balanced ecosystem. Humans have always modified the natural cycles of forest fires and grass fires, even before European contact, when plains groups and Rocky Mountain groups were so dependent on the abundance of the land. The last major forest fire in Purgatory was in 1996. Despite there not being a drought, with drought conditions at the time, 27 individuals tragically lost their lives in a sudden and unprecedented powerful natural disaster. Since this unfortunate event, Purgatory has not held the annual music festival in memory of those who lost their lives. Fortunately, our beloved sheriff, Nicole Hott, who was only 6 at the time, managed to escape the disaster by reaching the protection of the Ghost River. Our former sheriff, Randy Nedley, a deputy at the time, was the one who found young Nicole downriver and brought her to safety. Despite the dangerous nature of the forest fire and grass fires, the fires have the ability to rebuild the ecosystem and also expose previously unrecorded archaeological sites. If you survey an area of land that has been recently burned and observe exposed archaeological materials such as lithic or stone tools, metal tools, glass shards, pottery shards, or structural material like charred wood or sheet metal, please inform the Archaeological Survey and we'll make a note of what you see, and you can help us by taking notes also and UTMs of where you found it. Also photos. The Shelterlands Music Festival site will be one such example of a likely future archaeological site. The material remains of the festival and subsequent fire will help archaeologists piece together the story for future generations. For example, did you know that the site of the Woodstock Music Festival held excavations last year? Because it's a part of history. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are some mysteries regarding Purgatory's history and thus some of Purgatory's archaeology. I'm going to highlight some of these mysteries in the hopes that one of my listeners may happen to have some further information. The photo of the stairs on the upper left were sent to us last year by Jeremy Chetry. The photos, according to Mr. Chetry, were taken in the forest just outside of town. Mr. Chetry and his companion were unable to relocate the ruins of the structure to give the Purgatory Archaeological Survey a more precise location for further inspection. Curiously, no one else has reported seeing these ruins in the forest despite their apparent age and lack of foliage to obscure them. However, if you do see these ruins of the stair structure located somewhere in the forest northwest of town, please document their location and the condition of the site. If there appears to be any further disturbance or any further damage, please also note that. Please contact the survey of the geophysical location so that we may fully document the structure and any other features associated with the site. As the stair ruins appear to be from a larger previous structure, it's very unlikely that the ruins initially observed are all that remain. Also, please don't attempt to climb the stairs as the structural integrity is in question. And please don't remove any stones from the site either. After reviewing the BLM GLO plat maps and the patents of the general location of the site dating from the mid-1800s, as well as general highway maps dating to the 1930s, there does not appear to be any structure documented in that area. So again, if you have any further information regarding a 2-story stone and mortar structure that no one else can seem to find besides Jeremy Chetry, located somewhere in the vicinity of the Pine Barrens, please let us know. Last year, PAS became aware of an old rumor that Jack the Ripper had once resided in the Ghost River Triangle, which prompted us to do our own research on the infamous serial killer. Jack the Ripper was a nickname of an unidentified serial killer who was primarily active in the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. Endemic poverty in Whitechapel meant that many women resorted to sex work, and in 1888, the London police estimated there were 62 brothels and 1,200 women employed in sex work in Whitechapel alone. The majority of Jack's victims were female sex workers who lived in the East End slums. The trademark method of killing for the murderer led some to believe that the killer had some kind of surgical knowledge or medical training. A string of murders in the area continued in 1891, but investigators were unable to link all 11 victims to Jack the Ripper, and only 5 were considered conclusively linked to the same murderer, all of which were killed between August 31st and November 9th of 1888. The pervasive violence against women in Whitechapel added to the uncertainty of how many victims were killed by the same person. Ultimately, the identity of the murderer remained, and remains, unknown. The murder spree drew attention to the poor living conditions in the East End and solidified public outrage against overcrowding and unsanitary slums. The Housing Worker Act of 1890 and the Public Health Act of 1890 were passed soon after the majority of the Ripper murders took place, both of which setting standards for accommodations in an effort to transform degenerated urban areas. Within 2 decades of the murders, the worst of the slums were cleared and demolished. So what does this have to do with the Ghost River Triangle? Because the killer was never identified and the murders between 1888 and 1891 took place in a relatively short period of time, the rumor goes that the killer fled the area, even left London, and even left England altogether and made his way from the overcrowded slums to the wide-open frontier of the Ghost River Triangle and even Purgatory specifically. The rumor continues that Wyatt Earp and his comrade Doc Holliday even pursued the individual after he resumed his murders in the Ghost River area. The rumors never say if Earp and Holliday succeeded in their capture, but the Jack of Knives of Purgatory is believed to be the same Jack the Ripper of London. The photo in the top middle taken in Purgatory in the late 1800s is reportedly a photo of Jack of Knives standing at the end of the line on the far right. The canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. While focus is usually on the murderer himself, it should be recognized that these women had been married, had children, ran households, and held down jobs in domestic service, coffee houses, tin factories, and even sold song ballads. However, no amount of women's labor made enough money to cover her family's needs in comparison to men's labor at the time. 4 out of 5 of these women had left their husbands, which left them in social and economic ruin. Only 1 of these women had a permanent lodging. Thus, their social and economic situations would have appealed to a killer searching for victims in a place where poverty and neglect had become the norm of the slums of Whitechapel, most especially for women. In the beginning of the presentation, I touched on an old map of Purgatory and the Ghost River Triangle, which prompted a number of questions. Of those questions being why the town of Monument was one of the 3 places called out on the map. On the far bottom left, you'll see a rather beautiful photo of what looks like monoliths in the snow. This recently released photograph on social media has people buzzing. Where was it taken? There was a rumor circulating that this collection of monuments may be in the town of Monument, but we have no photographic evidence or eyewitness proof. The photo indicates the remoteness, the treelessness, the flatness of the area, which is common for eastern Alberta, but still, you'd think someone would have noticed these before now. Also, one can't help but note the physical similarities between Monument and sites like Stonehenge, pictured in the photo immediately to the right, that are common in Northern Europe. The door-like shape of the monoliths that create Stonehenge are seemingly replicated in the actual door features of Monument, which may be actually in Monument, if that makes sense. It's also curious. If you have any further information about this large stone feature on a treeless open landscape, or actually any of the mysteries we discussed today, please contact the survey. In the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned something about being a good steward. So what does that mean? Stewardship refers to a preservation movement that focuses on protecting and maintaining historic and archaeological sites for future generations. Archaeologists, anthropologists, museum curators, government regulators, and members of descendant stakeholder communities all have been considered stewards. But stewardship also includes collaborative, inclusive discourses and practices that recognize the relationships many people have with the past. There are many federal, state, or provincial level public programs that encourage engagement with and good stewardship for the average citizen, for anybody. Off to the right here, we have compiled just a handful of state-run or university-affiliated archaeological stewardship programs that are open to the public and can get you involved in archaeology in just about every way you can think of. But it is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many programs across the country that I'm sure a Google search of archaeology stewardship programs in your region could give you lots of options. I want to shout out specifically the Arkansas Archaeological Society, the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and the Archaeology in the Community program specifically as having amazing nationally ranked programs that are worth planning your vacation around to go work on one of their events. Archaeology in the Community is the official charity of the Archeo Gaming Con, and if you go to archaeologyinthecommunity.com/donate and send a pic of your confirmation to archifantasies@gmail.com, you can get some Archeo Gaming Con swag. So get on that. Okay, so we talked about what good stewardship is, but what does it look like? So good stewardship is healthy interaction. Of course, you can go delve deep into this. There's whole classes and discourses on this, but I'm going to give you a good, quick overview that I think would be helpful. So first is healthy interaction. For example, when you visit a museum, a historic site, or an archaeological site, always go in with as much context as possible. In almost all the scenarios, especially in the United States or other countries that have been colonized, there is an element of colonialism to all of these sites. Ask yourself how the artifacts got to the museum. How were they acquired? How this post-contact site came to be in ancestral indigenous lands, and so on. Context makes all the difference. If you find a site, also don't destroy it, don't damage it, don't climb on it, don't litter, don't loot. Especially if you know a site was an important religious or ceremonial center to a group of people. Please, please, please treat it with respect. If you find an archaeological site, please document it. Document it by taking notes on the location of your general location of where it's at, your location to water, location to a home, etc. Take photos. Also, with smartphones now, the GPS triangulation is really, really good. So if you can take a snapshot of where you are with Google Maps even, that can be super helpful. But there are also other map apps which are very, very useful that you can get even UTM coordinates to be more specific that you can use to explain this to the archaeological survey that you're communicating with. Or you can also talk to your local society chapters. So usually in a province or a state, you have a larger survey, but then you also have regional chapters where you have specific people over that region who you can contact who may know more about where you live specifically. It's also protection and preservation. So discourage and report looting. Looting is an issue everywhere, but it's especially an issue in certain regions where there's more material context for things or more monumental architecture that kind of lets people know to go look for things. When I say monumental architecture, think of things like pueblos here in the United States, or mounds are really common in the Southeast. So definitely report looting if you see it. It is illegal, and definitely discourage it if you see anyone picking anything up. Instead, encourage preservation and protection. So encourage people to interact well with the site, be respectful of the site, leave the site how you found it. You can also make NRHP nominations yourself, or reach out to local historical societies or archaeology society chapters to assist you with nominations. If you think that there is a house or a building or a structure or a site that doesn't already have an NRHP nomination, which you should be able to find online if they already are listed, you can download forms online or contact your state historic preservation office and they can direct you on what to do next. It's also education, so finding and reading and using reputable sources, going to public talks that are given by surveys or universities or society chapter meetings, or national parks are a great place to have some year-round activities for people who are interested in the archaeology, state parks as well. We also encourage research, so exploring on your own, again, with those reputable sources, and finding those open source materials. And then, of course, sharing your knowledge with others. What did you find out? I mean, there may be stuff down the road that you've known about your whole life, but someone in your town has no idea. So take a friend, share it with them, do research together, because, last point, enjoyment. History and archaeology is interesting. You don't have to be an archaeologist or a historian to find it interesting. I just happen to get paid to do it. But everyone has some stake in some kind of history, and especially with this land that we're living on, it's our responsibility to be good stewards to make sure that we can maintain the sites that are here, because once an archaeological site is destroyed, it's destroyed forever. I can't go to Walmart and buy a new one and put it in the ground. So we have to maintain what we have and be smart about it and document everything we can if it is impacted in some way. What does it not look like? It certainly doesn't look like Mr. Bobo Del Rey and his clandestine digging company, who refuses to follow state and federal laws regarding proper permitting for environmental and cultural resource laws. I told you we have feelings about Mr. Bobo Del Rey here at the survey. And it definitely does not look like disturbing or removing human remains without first contacting a coroner, who then may contact the state archaeologist, who will determine if the remains are recent or not, but will follow lawful Native American graves protection and repatriation protocol. In short, never take home, remove, or damage human remains. Looking at you, Mr. McCready. Call local authorities if you think you may have come across human remains. Don't touch them, don't disturb them. Again, get an expert out to look at them. It's better just to be hands off. So, kind of a segue into this good stewardship thing was this idea that we had here at PAS for Flat Research Waverly. So, Flat Research Waverly is a tool for folks to use to interact with history. I wanted to find a way where people could document the history around them, share with others, because again, like I said, you could be in the same town as someone else or the same state and never know that something like that exists practically in your backyard. Or maybe you don't get to travel as much, especially during COVID. So we have ERPers and archaeologists and archaeology lovers and history lovers all over the world. And this is a great way to show cool history and cool archaeology with people on social media through our most popular person in Purgatory, Waverly. So you can take her exploration down the street, exploration across the country, or across the room to your bookshelf. Again, especially during COVID. If you've got some really cool history books that you want to show off, that you want to kind of condense into a little snippet or a thread, please show Research Waverly your cool history book or archaeology book. She's down for it. We don't discriminate here at PAS with the kind of history that you want to show. So, yeah, and like I said, share with her. So what did you learn? Help inform and educate others on social media. So it can be just about anything. Books, houses. Here we have Hot to Scott on Twitter showing us King Arthur's seat in Edinburgh. I mean, it can be literally anything. And so you may be thinking, again, houses, King Arthur's seat. I don't have King Arthur's seat in my backyard. PAS. What am I supposed to do? So it can really be anything. Use your imagination on what history means to you. History sites, archaeology sites, historic buildings, historic homes, a historic plaque that's sitting next to a park, a diorama that's in an old downtown area with old pictures of what the main street looked like, history books, like I said, or historic photographs, historic maps. Oh, I love historic maps. Or even your family history. Remember, history is anything 50 years or older in the U.S., and if you're not in the US, bend the rules a little bit. History is history. So I want to see it. I'd love to share it with you guys. And once you do share it with me, I'll spread it around too. So where can you find Flat Research Waverly? Well, you can find her my pinned tweet on my Twitter profile. So go to my profile at Purgatory Archeo, and she's pinned there with a thread. You can, there's a Google Drive link there where you can find a PDF where you can download the PDF for free and you can print her out yourself. You can also go to my Redbubble or TeePublic store fronts and you can buy a magnet or a sticker or a greeting card and cut her out. And then the third option is that if neither printing nor the storefront is available to you, just let me know if that's not feasible. And I can get your details and I can send you one because I really want to make her as accessible as possible for people. And again, remember to share your explorations and your adventures on social media. And if you do, use the hashtag #FlatResearchWaverly, and you can even tag me and let me know. And I would love to share that with everyone else. So Like I said, if you need a flat research Waverly, hit me up, slip into my DMs on Instagram or Twitter. Or if you just have a comment or a question about something you heard today, or you want to share some cool archaeology, get a hold of me. And this artwork I had commissioned by the fabulous Olivia J. Taylor, who you can find on Twitter, is the epitome of why I love the Earp Sisters and the helpfulness of Nicole Hott and Doc and of course Jeremy. But I just want to say a disclaimer to anyone who came to our Society Dig last year. We did not give Winona Earp the Indiana Jones whip. She found that on her own. That's not like regulation. I mean, it was, to be honest, we kind of didn't want to give her a shovel or a trowel either, but I mean, she has a gun she carries around, so we figured she could probably handle a trowel. But we apologize to anyone who was actually injured last year with that whip. That's not on us. So again, I hope you found this interesting. Please get a hold of me on Twitter or Instagram. Thank you for joining PAS on this adventure with me. And there is so much history and so much archaeology still to be discussed about Purgatory and the Ghost River Triangle, but maybe that just means I have more to give you for next year for the Archeo Gaming Con. Thanks for tuning in and watching. I appreciate it.